All right. Our next story comes to us from Japan, and there's many different iterations of this story. Commonly, you'll hear it as the crane wife, but there are a lot of different versions, and I was really interested in a particular version about an older couple that has a crane come to visit them. So this is my version of the crane wife, which is the crane daughter. Now the story takes us to Japan, to a minka, which is a little cottage with sort of a thatched triangle roof and plaster walls. We're on the outskirts of town, so we're kind of like surrounded by trees, and it's still spring, or spring is approaching, it's early spring, so there's still little piles of snow here and there under the trees that is hanging on stubbornly. From outside of the minka, the door opens, and someone backs out of it and closes the door behind her. It's an old woman, and she's bowed over a bolt of fabric that she's carrying in her arms. She turns and she carefully steps down the steps to ground level, and she walks down the path to town, straight to the marketplace. She gets to the marketplace and she finds her favorite fabric vendor. She goes over there and she trades this fabric that she's cradling for a pile of coins. And then she looks around the stalls looking for her favorite places to pick up the food she needs for the week: the rice, the fish, the miso paste, the pickled daikon and radish. And as she scans the marketplace, she sees something unusual, a flash of white and wooden bars. Oh, well, she storms right over to that vendor and she pokes him in the chest with the arthritic hands, and she says, "You, how dare you?" And the merchant said, whoa, lady, what is going on? What are you so mad about? And she said, "You should know better than to keep a crane in a cage. Let it go." Well, he said, "Whoa, lady, look. I'm just a purveyor of merchandise. If you want to let the crane go ahead and buy it, and you can do whatever you want with it." Well, she looked down at this little pile of coins in her hand, just enough for the rice and the fish and the miso and the pickled daikon and radish that she needed for the week. And she looked at that crane. Cranes are symbols of longevity and hope and peace. She didn't really need the longevity part. She lived just about as long as she wanted to. But she could use some peace. She really hoped for a peaceful death, just going to sleep and just not waking up in the morning. So she figured a hungry belly for a week was an even trade-off for that. She handed over those coins to the merchant, and she did not pick up the cage and carry it with her. No, she bent down and unlatched it and opened the door. And everyone in the marketplace watched as that crane unfolded itself from the cage. It stood tall as the old woman herself. It had long, skinny, black legs and pure white feathers, with just the tips, the pin feathers were pearlescent black, and a shock of crimson red across its head. Well, it turned its eye on that old woman and pierced her like it was pinning her, memorizing her for later. And then it dipped its knees, lifted its wings, and soared into the sky above the marketplace, where it circled once, twice, 3 times, and away. Well, that old woman gave the vendor one last, she picked up that cage and her one coin that was left, and she walked over to the market and she picked up just what she could afford. She got some sweet onions and a little bit of fish paste. And she made her way home with that fish paste and the sweet onions hanging in one hand and the cage swinging in the other. Well, the next day, a storm came in. It was an unexpected sort of, late spring storm, and it was snowing. So she woke up that morning and she kind of could hear the patter of the snow. She said, when she woke up, she said, "Darn it." Not because of the snow, but because she woke up. She rolled off of her sleeping mat, got herself up, and she got some water going on the stove. She sliced some onions thin, threw them in. And then she went to a large wardrobe that stood on one wall. It was wooden and carved with these intricate carvings. And she opened it up It did not squeak because it was very carefully oiled. And she pulled out a bolt of fabric from inside. And then she went and she sat next to her fire, and she picked up her sewing kit, and she began to embroider the edges of that fabric, turning it from a beautiful piece of fabric into something that a bride would be proud to wear on her wedding day. Well, she sat there until she heard the storm kind of blowing through her house. She could hear the patter of snow against the walls, and it got too dark to do such fine sewing work. And then, kunk, 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 there was a knock on her door. She set the fabric aside. She went to the door, she opened it, and standing there was a young woman. She was just wearing a thin white kimono, and she was shivering because it was snowing. And she said, "Grandmother, thank you for opening your door on a stranger. I was looking for family in the area, and I couldn't find them, and I'm lost now, and I'm afraid that I won't find them before it's too cold." Well, the old woman said, come in. You can't stand out there in the cold and you in just this thin kimono. Get in here before you freeze to death on my doorstep. And she brought the young woman in, and she set her down in her second favorite spot, and she got her a cup of that broth that was brewing, and she handed it to her. She said, "Onion soup. It's disgusting, but it'll keep you warm from the inside." And then she sat down and she had a cup of onion soup herself. She said, let me stoke the fire a little bit higher and make sure that you get warm. And she bent down over that cage, and she broke the cage into pieces, all those wooden slats, and she fed him into the fire. And they sat there sipping their onion soup and watching that cage blaze into ashes. Well, the next morning, they both rolled up off of their sleeping mats, and the storm was still going. You still couldn't really see very far. It was still very cold. The old woman said, "You can't leave in this. It's far too cold. Your family will understand one more day of a delay. You must stay here." And the young woman said, "Of course, grandmother. But as long as I'm here, is there anything I can help you with?" And she looked around this small minka. There were 4 walls. It was a single room, and all the walls were plastered, and everything was very tidy and clean except for the walls above where the old woman could reach. So there were like cobwebs up in the corners. There was some patches of plaster that had fallen off. There was a hole in the thatching of the roof over here that snow was kind of falling through. And the old woman said, "Help if you must, but I'm just going to sit here and work on my stitching." And she did. She sat down and she pulled out that bolt of cloth, and she got to work on her embroidery. And the young woman spent the day tidying and cleaning and dusting everything that the old woman couldn't reach. There was their sleeping mats that were in one corner, that big wardrobe on the one side, the stove in the middle. And then in the corner with the best light was a loom for weaving. So the young woman, she worked on dusting and getting everything tidy. And as everything got darker, they sat by that fire. They sipped their onion soup together. Well, the next morning, they woke up again. And the young woman said, "I can't leave before I finished my cleaning. I've only got about halfway through." So the old woman said, "Do as you must." And she sat down with her embroidery. They got some onions going on the stove. And so the young woman kind of finished all of her cleaning. And right around midday, she had finished. And the old woman said, "I suppose you'll be going now to find your family." And the young woman said, "Oh, no. I could not leave in the middle of the day. What if they're far? I should leave in the morning when I have a whole day to travel. But while I'm here, why don't I help you a little bit more?" So she worked on patching the walls, all of those pieces of wall that had fallen off. She spent the rest of the day doing that. And then they sat down that evening with their onion soup. And then they went to bed. And the next morning they woke up, and the old woman said, "All right, I guess you're going to find your family." And the young woman said, "But I couldn't possibly leave before I finished patching the walls. I'm only halfway done." And the old woman said, "Do as you must." And she got to work on her embroidery. And the young woman finished patching those walls. And at just about midday, she finished. And the old woman said, "I suppose you're leaving." And the young woman said, "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly leave in the middle of the day. I'll leave tomorrow when I have a whole day to travel. But while I'm here, why don't I work on that hole in the roof?" So she got to work thatching the hole in the roof. And then that evening, it got dark, and they sat down with their onion soup. Well, the next morning, they got up. The old woman said, "I suppose you'll be leaving to go find your family?" And the young woman said, "I'm only halfway done thatching the roof. Why don't I just finish that before I leave?" So she finished thatching the roof, and she finished about midday. She said, "I shouldn't leave in the middle of the day. But grandmother, would you please tell me about your stitching? And she did. They sat together, and the old woman explained that she used to weave. She said, that loom in the corner used to be my best friend. We wove beautiful fabric together, but my old bones just don't want to do that kind of hard work anymore. So now she just sits there dusty, and I've got this old stash of fabric in that wardrobe over there. And every day or every week, I take out a bolt and I embroider the edges and get a little bit more for that fine handiwork for it. And I've counted it up. If I live about as long as my parents and my sisters did, then I should have enough bolts of fabric to make it through all the weeks I've got left, with just a couple left to spare for whoever finds my body here. And I hope that, I hope it's enough that they'll sit my wake and pick my bones out of the ashes when I'm gone, but it's probably too much to ask of a stranger. Well, they sat there with their onion soup and they went to bed. The next morning, the old woman woke up, and before she could open her eyes, she heard, "Ohio, grandmother, I have an idea." And she said, "It's too early for ideas. Tea first." She got up and she drank her tea, and the young woman said, "Grandmother, we will start a stitching circle. There must be other ladies here that love to gossip while they do their work, and we'll gather them together. We'll have them come here so you don't have to walk to them, and they'll come once a week." And the old woman said, "Well, once a week? Don't you need to get back to your family?" And the young woman said, "Oh, no, they were not expecting me. They won't miss me. Let's get this started." And so the next market day came, and the young woman was going to go with the old woman. So the old woman went into that wardrobe, and she picked up the fabric sheet embroidered that week, and she rolled it all up, and then she looked at that pile of onion skins. She went to the wardrobe and she pulled out a second bolt of fabric to take to market. Well, they walked their way to market together, and at the market, the young woman went around gathering ladies for the stitching circle and getting that planned, and the old woman went around shopping for two. Well, at the first stitching circle, all the ladies sat around, I forgot it. Let me remember where we're at. Yep. So they all sat around, and the talk, as it always does, it turned to their children. And one of them turned to the old woman and said, "How about you, Auntie? How are your children doing? How are they disappointing you these days?" And the old woman just shook her head. She didn't have any children. She patted her hand and said, "Next life, yes, we'll hope for that." Well, this became a routine. Stitching circle once a week, market once a week, 2 bolts of fabric now, shopping for 2. And every market day, as they walked back home together, the young woman and the old woman would say, "Now that I've shopped, done all this, twice as much food, we bought all this food, I'm sure you'll be going to your family now and leave me try to eat all this by myself." And they laughed about it as if it was a joke. But one day, she said it, and the young woman looked at her out of the side of her eye and said, "Grandmother, I have found my family." Wow. Time went on, and the day came when that stack of bolts of fabric in the wardrobe got low, and finally, when the old woman opened it, there was just 1 bolt left. She pulled it out. It was black, shiny silk that was shot through with a silver brocade. And she held it very gently. "I had really hoped not to have to trade this one. This is the last fabric that I wove for my husband. He did not get to wear it before he died." And a tear splashed down onto that black silk next to her wrinkled hand. The young woman's pale, smooth hand reached out, and she said, "Grandmother, let me help. That loom in the corner, does it still work?" And grandmother said, the old woman said, "Well, of course it still works. I keep her in great condition. She's just dusty." And the young woman said, "Okay then, I will weave fabric. I will weave and you can embroider, but you must make me a promise, grandmother. You must promise never to watch me work. For any reason, you cannot watch me. Promise." And the old woman said, I've seen enough weaving in my life. I don't need to watch another young person mess it up. Go on, go on. And so they set up paper screens around the loom, and the young woman disappeared behind those paper screens. And the house filled with a music that the old woman had not heard in a very long time. Rika bata tone, rika bata tone, rika bata tone, rika bata tone. The sound of the loom, this music that had been the underscoring of her life for so long. She thought of all of the beautiful fabric that she had woven that became kimonos and obi and hanten. She thought of her wedding, of her handsome husband, the sake, the thousands of cranes that her family and friends had folded, hoping for them to have a productive marriage and children. Rika bata tone, rika bata tone. And evening came, and the old woman scooped out some rice and fish for the young woman, but when she came out from behind the screens, she said, oh no, I'm too tired to eat. And she did look tired. Her eyes were kind of drooping. And she said, I'll eat in the morning. And she went straight to her sleeping mat and fell asleep. Well, the old woman looked behind those screens. She'd promised not to watch the young woman. She didn't promise not to look at what she was making, right? So she looked behind those screens and she saw on the loom this pure, white, shimmering fabric that had an occasional, just very thin streak of pearlescent black. And along the borders, a delicate design of crimson red that she had never seen before. And she looked closely. She could not figure out how that design had been woven. Well, she went to bed, and the next morning they woke up. The young woman went back behind those screens, and the house filled with that music, Rika bata tone, Rika bata tone. And she thought about peeking just to see, how does she do that? How is she weaving that border? I must know. But she had made a promise. Well, dark came, the young woman came back around from the paper screens, and her hair hung a little bit loose. She was starting to get circles under her eyes, and she said, oh, grandmother, I'll eat in the morning. She went to bed. And the old woman looked behind the screens again, and she studied that fabric, and this time she noticed something she had not noticed before. There were no cones of silk. There were no spools of thread. There was no fiber to be woven. Well, the next morning they woke up, the young woman went back behind that screen, and this time the music was punctuated. Rika bata tone, 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 Rika bata tone. And the old woman said, oh, she's hurting herself. Well, what if she's using the loom wrong? What if her form is bad? She's going to injure herself. And she finally understood what her mother had meant when she said, first you bleed for your children, and then they sweat for you. Because she would have given all of her blood in this moment to make that young woman stop making those sounds. She was crept up to the screen. She tried to see the silhouette, figure out what she was doing wrong, that she was hurting herself so badly, and she couldn't make it out. So she thought to herself, I promised I wouldn't look, but she's hurting herself, but I promised. But she's in pain, but I promised. And the whole time, this music, this Rika bata tone, Rika bata tone, Rika bata tone, Rika bata tone. And finally she peeks behind the screen, and she covers a gasp, because sitting there is not the young woman. Standing in front of the loom is a crane on skinny black legs with pure white feathers. And as she watches, the crane reaches around with its long beak and plucks out a feather and weaves it into the fabric. Rika bata tone, 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 Rika bata tone. The young woman, or the old woman, backed away from the screens, and she got into her sleeping mat and she covered her head with the blanket, and she stayed there until the next morning. Now, the next morning, she heard, oh, hi-oh, grandmother, I've made tea. She uncovered her head with that blanket, and she looked, and sitting there was the young woman. She had a head, she had 2 arms, she had 10 fingers, perfectly human. And she was sitting with that bolt of shimmering white fabric on her lap, that bolt that had the black pearlescent stripes through it and that crimson red border along the edges. And the young woman said, grandmother, I know You looked. I know that you watched me working. I have to leave. I do not want to, but a promise is a promise, and broken is broken. But I've made you this, and I hope it's enough to, well, it could never be enough to thank you. It could never be enough to thank you for burning that cage. And she stood up and went to set that fabric down, and the old woman said, wait, wait. She got up and she went to the wardrobe and she pulled out that black silk fabric with the silver brocade. She held it out. She said, please, take this. And they traded white for black, silver for crimson. The young woman took the black fabric and she walked outside. The old woman followed her, and the young woman shook out that black fabric and draped it over her arms. It hung long. And then she looked at the old woman with a dark brown eye, smiled. And then she raised her arms into the air, and wind out of nowhere whipped around her, and the fabric was circling around her. Her kimono sleeves were waving, and the skirt was wrapping around her legs. And as the old woman watched, that kimono turned into feathers, pure white, with a tip of pearlescent black on the tip of each wing. Her legs skinnied up into long bird's legs, and her face lengthened into a beak, and in front of the old woman stood a crane. The crane looked at her one last time, dipped its legs, lifted its wings, and soared into the air, where it circled once, twice, 3 times, and away. Now, when the old woman died, her stitching circle ladies found her. She did not have to wait very long. They sat at her wake, and after her cremation, or when they were sitting at her wake, the priest was chanting, and a crane walked up to the door and stood there watching, listening. And after her cremation, the ladies picked up these long chopsticks, going to pick her bones out of the ashes to place into a funeral urn. But just as they were beginning, that crane walked in through the door. It looked at everyone, and then it used its long beak to pick her toes, her toe bone first, dipped its beak into the urn, and it moved all the way up her body, toes first, legs, her hips, her skull, so that she would be upright in death. And then it looked at everyone one last time, and it walked out of that cremation room, dipped its legs, lifted its wings, and soared into the sky and away. Thank you.